name's Gillian Dow. I'm the Vice President of the British Association for Romantic Studies, and it's an absolute delight to be chairing this panel this evening. In April 1989, the founders of the British Association for Romantic Studies met at King Alfred's College, Winchester, for a conference entitled Reviewing Romanticism, and with a view to the establishment of a British Association of Romantic Studies. They could have had no idea that just over 30 years later, we would have the technology to unite our members across different time zones from a great many different countries and in our own homes. Well, I think that some of them are with us this evening, so we must ask them if they had any idea of that. But one thing that the authors of the Winchester Manifesto of 1989 made explicit is that in the light of soaring conference costs excluding many scholars, they wanted to make sure that events were accessible, welcoming, and open to scholars at the beginning of their careers. This remains the case for the Bars Committee today. On behalf of that committee, I am proud to say that the Bar's online events programme is entirely devised by postgrad and recent postdoctoral scholars. Thanks therefore to Amanda Davies, Colette Davies, Francesca Killoran, Anna Mercer and Matt Sangster. It was a great honour to be invited to chair this panel of distinguished speakers on your behalf, and it's your energy that has brought us together under these trying circumstances. There's no doubt that our current climate is trying indeed. The 1989 manifesto drew attention to the far-reaching changes in Romantic studies brought about by transformations in the theory and practice of literary criticism and the resurgence of historicist forms of analysis. It may be harder today to uncouple the changes in the field of Romantic studies from changes in the academy more broadly, from the neoliberalisation of education to the privileging of STEM subjects to attacks on the study of humanities in general. What is clear, and what the Digital Events panel wanted to make sure of, is that this forum should include scholars at all stages of their academic careers to talk about some of these issues. So to present research-led papers, certainly, but also to discuss challenges. We want these meetings to be useful, so do get in touch with ideas for future topics. I now want to introduce our speakers for today, and I will do so only very briefly so that we have plenty of time to hear them speak as well as for discussion. Each of our speakers has published extensively on Romantic period literature and thought and served on editorial boards and as editors of a variety of studies of Romanticism. They have agreed to the democratizing principle of speaking in alphabetical order. So we'll hear first from Professor James Chandler, followed by Professor Ian Duncan, then Dr. Katie Garner, then Professor Essaka Joshua, and finally Professor Fiona Stafford. And I invite you to keep questions and discussion until we've heard all our speakers talk. So let us welcome, to begin our proceedings, Professor James Chandler, the William B. Ogden Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. Jim is the General Editor of Cambridge University Press's Studies in Romanticism series and the author of many publications of Romantic literature and politics. Jim, welcome. Would you like to unmute and put your camera on so we can all hear you speak and start our proceedings today?
Okay.
Hello, welcome.
Hello, Gillian. Thanks so much for the invitation. BARS is such an important organization, and that was a brilliant way to frame this event in light of its founding circumstances. I didn't realize I was going first, but it makes some sense since I'll be giving some historical perspective on the problem. I'll also be drafting off some work that I've been doing lately, which I'll be summarizing only telegraphically. So I come to this question about the future of Romantic studies as someone who's been thinking about the fate of criticism more generally, and also about the crucial relationship between the categories of criticism and Romanticism over the last century. I've just finished a pedagogical book for Blackwell titled How to Do Criticism, which revisits I.A. Richards' project of practical criticism with 3 key revisions: challenging its lyric paradigm, reading texts relationally rather than singly, and expanding the field to include the screen arts toward which Richards was explicitly hostile. I take some of my cues for this book from Raymond Williams's challenges to Richards, and I've written up the relation of these 2 critics in a recent essay in Critical Inquiry, which I'll be cannibalizing a little bit here. Central to Williams's evolving understanding of Richards, as I read him, was an account of Richards' ideas about poetics and reading practices as derivative from Wordsworth's. Williams considered Richards, and not Leavis, as is commonly thought, to be the pivotal figure in modern criticism, and he came to see Richards' Wordsworth-derived project as deeply flawed. His challenge to Richards, his entire critical program, really, as it took shape around the idea of the structure of feeling, was also a critique of Wordsworthian Romanticism, in particular, what Williams came to call the active-passive theory of reading. This is a category that I believe Williams saw Richards as having derived from Wordsworth's account of his own ideas about reading, and especially in the essay supplementary of 1815, that important text. I've written up this relation in an essay called Coming Out in Romantic Practice. Now, a second challenge to Wordsworth's place in both Romanticism and criticism was developed in America by Jerome McGann, whose early campaign depended on a replacement of Wordsworth by Byron. I've written up this story in an essay soon to appear in a special issue of Studies in Romanticism about McGann's legacy. Now, in McGann's challenge, the crucial concept is that of the canon, but in 2 divergent senses, both as a list of approved authors and as a body of critical rules and norms. From the early 1970s, long before the Romantic ideology, McGann set out to challenge Wordsworth's place at the top of the list of approved authors in our field by asserting the claims of Byron there. And in so doing, McGann challenged a vast array of critical rules and procedures, ways of reading, that had formed around that Wordsworthian legacy. McGann shows no signs of blaming all this on Richards, much as Williams would come to do, but it is a similar kind of critique of the project of practical criticism. His early review of natural supernaturalism is the first place you find this in 1972. But unlike Williams, who seems to give up on the category of Romanticism over time, McGann reinvents it. And likewise, he hangs on to the idea of a central figure in the field. Byron replaces Wordsworth. What I don't have time to work out here is that McGann modeled this campaign on Byron's own challenge to the place of Wordsworth in his championing of Pope, and that this whole understanding of criticism depends on a divergence that developed over time between Pope and Wordsworth and Byron, between the canon as list and the canon as norm. In Pope, those 2 things are the same. A subsequent challenge to Wordsworth's place in Romantic canonicity came from Marilyn Butler, to whom both Williams's work and McGann's were well known. At my instigation, Butler once produced an essay during the 1988 celebrations of Wordsworth entitled Romanticism Without Wordsworth. It was a brief counterfactual history of the period following from the premise that Wordsworth had nobly died in the Terror after returning once more to be with Annette Vallon. I'm sure many of you know it. In this version, Southey replaces Wordsworth in the story, but over the next decade or more, Butler would develop a different paradigm around the figure of Maria Edgeworth, not a poet and by no means just a novelist. Butler was highly conscious that larger changes in literary studies from the 70s to the 90s, especially she was conscious of these changes, especially what in the general introduction to her Pickering and Chatto edition of Wordsworth she called, quote, a widening of the syllabus to include women's writing, cultural studies, and post-colonial literature. She might have also added Irish studies, Four Nations literary history, and historicism itself. I take such comments to mean that, as with Williams, but for slightly different reasons, the category of Romanticism itself mattered less and less to Butler over time. A larger canon shift was altering fields well beyond Romantic studies, and it cut through the early 19th century at different angles. When Butler asserts that Edgeworth is the most important Irish writer between Swift and Yeats, for example, she is registering Edgeworth within the newly burgeoning field of Irish studies. Edgeworth figures a horizon, one might say, not in one field, but in many. All this is to say that the Edgeworth whose cause Butler promotes in the 1990s is not quite like Abrams or Richard's Wordsworth, or even like McGann's Byron, to be considered a representative romantic. Indeed, at our current juncture, 20 years removed from Butler's great intervention in behalf of Edgeworth, it may no longer be possible to play variations on arguments that Isaac Disraeli and Byron inaugurated in the Pope controversy, and that McGann made so productive in the first half of his career. Challenges to canonical order have less consequence because such orders now feel splintered, multiple, and localized in the first place. So where does this leave us? One answer, and I have more questions than answers here. One answer is Butler's intersectionality. This is, after all, the way English departments now hire in these historical fields, and it seems likely that they will continue to do so for some time to come. Romanticism in gender studies, Romanticism in race studies, Romanticism in environmental studies, Romanticism in transnational studies. This new dispensation has earned its share of critique, some of it perhaps deserved. I myself think it's important to maintain the category of Romanticism, even in this revised form, and equally important, not to lapse into merely nominalist chronological markers of the period like 1780 to 1830, or worse, to lose it altogether to the long 18th century or the long 19th century. Romantic and Romanticism share a grammar with a family of terms, say classicist, Renaissance, Enlightenment, Gothic, modern, even early modern, that together have been useful in the past and going forward will continue to work better as an ensemble that they do apart, especially in comparatist contexts. And the claims of Romanticism to matter to the larger practices of criticism in all literary and cultural fields may well depend on maintaining its vitality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's always always very exciting to be reminded of the scholarship of people who really defined the field for me as an undergraduate student, in fact, as well as a graduate student. And it was interesting looking back on the early programs of BAR's conferences and seeing actually that the field was very wide to start with. The number of papers on women's writers in that 1989 conference was really quite striking to me. I wouldn't have predicted it before going back. There will be a lot more that we'll want to bring out from your paper, not least the excitement of being in a department that may be in the position to hire a professor of Romanticism and anything at all. We're nowhere near in that position at Southampton, I'm afraid. But we've decided that we're going to hear all the speakers and then keep discussion and questions to the end. So thank you again. And I'd now like to turn to Professor Ian Duncan, the Florence Green Bixby Chair in English at the University of California, Berkeley, General Editor of the Collected Works of James Hogg, co-editor of the Edinburgh Critical Studies and Romanticism series, and the author of a great many publications that we all know on Romanticism and the novel. Ian, if I can invite you to switch your camera on and turn your microphone on and talk to us now, please.
Thank you, Gillian. Can you hear and see me? Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for this invitation. For some reason, I'm only seeing you. So I'm going to switch to gallery view. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure as well as an honor to be here and to be able to speak to so many of you from all across the planet. And I wish we could all be in the same physical space. I'm not going to do anything nearly so interesting or ambitious as Jim just treated us to. I'm going to just speak in a fairly ad hoc manner to some work I found particularly provocative and stimulating that's come out over the last few years. And this is more about thinking about some interesting experiments, methodological and other in the field, and possible avenues that those might lead to. They're avenues that I have not really explored myself. And I want to begin with a book that struck me when I read it. I read it adventitiously because I happened to review it, that came out 5 years ago. This is Eric Jidal's book called Oceanic Unconformities, Bardic Poetry in the Industrial Age. A fascinating book because it offers a radical experiment in methodology. It's what Jidal calls a stratigraphic criticism that combines book and reception history with environmental history in order to undertake an analysis of layers of material evidence, material processes that register changes in the geophysical environment that may not be accessible to human cognition, to human intellectual processing. In this case, Jidal refers both to textual strata of reference and allusion within the published work, in this case, the body of Oceanic poetry, translated supposedly by James Macpherson in the 1760s, and then the work's remediation and recasting in subsequent editions and variants, leading well into the Victorian heyday of the Industrial Revolution in Glasgow and the west of Scotland. And what struck me about this, and as I say, was really the experimental reach that Jidal is making here. We know that humanities, environmental criticism is now a burgeoning and vibrant and really interesting field in studies in Romanticism and elsewhere. But what Jidal does is try to think beyond a thematic mode of eco-criticism, and by doing that to reach outside an anthropocentric frame of reference, something that's really hard to do. Literary texts are produced by humans. They necessarily entail sort of human structures and processes of thinking and feeling. And so Jidal's experiment I find exceptionally interesting. It's been taken up by some other recent work. I'm thinking of a couple of recent essays by Tobias Meneely, one on it's called Cooper's Task in the Time of Climate Change. It came out in PMLA in 2012, and another called Late Holocene Poetics, Genre and Geohistory in Beachy Head. Interestingly, both Cooper's Task and Beachy Head have recently moved to the center of our field, largely thanks, and I'm going to blow my institutional horn here, to my brilliant colleague Kevis Goodman, who has developed modes of reading these works as highly sensitive registers for ongoing, unfinished, open, the history in the present. And I think what's striking about this work and some allied work is the way that it's trying to get us to think about literary forms and genres as not just formal registers of material processes that, as I say, may escape human cognition, but as themselves material events or processes. This I find extraordinarily interesting. I'm not sure where to go with it myself, but it's something well worth thinking about. The second thing that I think Jidal's book does really valuably is recall and redirect our attention to the corpus of Oceanic poetry. And I'll just pause and say I'm particularly delighted that Fiona Stafford will be speaking later on this panel, because Fiona's most recent work has begun to intervene in important ways in environmental criticism in our field. But she, of course, also really brought the Oceanic poems back as modern works, as modern experiments, thereby bypassing the rather tedious debates about authenticity and forgery, into which I think so much commentary still, alas, remains bogged down. But Jidal, I think, helps us begin to think about these as radical experiments, as arguably one of the origins of what we later call Romanticism, as an international movement, as opposed to its sort of Anglo-centric trajectory in which the Oceanic corpus really gets occluded. So he brings Macpherson's translations back as a rich resource for, I think, reimagining an international genealogy of Romantic poetics via revivals and reinventions of indigenous genres. And the work I want to sort of point to here, as I think aligned with what Jidal is doing, is the recent work of Maureen Mclean, whose brilliant book, Balladeering Minstrelsy and the Making of British Romantic Poetry, came out a while ago, 2008, and I think gives us ways of rethinking the genealogy of Wordsworthian lyric, in new ways that I think have still yet to be sort of picked up on and developed fully in the directions that Mclean points us in. And more recently, she co-authored with Laura Slatkin a 2011 article called British Romantic Homer, Oral Tradition, Primitive Poetry and the Emergence of Comparative Poetics in Britain, in which she thinks about what she calls two methodologically linked moves, the conjectural and comparative, in the Scottish Enlightenment history of man, science of man, and thinks about the way that these come to bear on the archaeology of primitive poetry in Scotland, in Britain, but also more widely in Europe and beyond Europe, indeed. One of the things that is so interesting about the kind of Oceanic phenomenon is its reach across the Atlantic and imperial and colonial and indeed post-colonial world well through the 19th century. Mclean's attention, I think, to thinking about form and genre in relation to media and as media, I think helps us link her project with some of the directions in which Jidal is pointing, and gets us to think again about how form and genre may be thought about as sort of material events or processes. Now, I work mainly on the novel, though I'm having to think about some of this other material. I have an outstanding book that's way overdue for Cambridge that's supposed to offer an overview of so-called Scottish Romanticism, whatever that is, that has meant my having to now reckon seriously with these fascinating 18th century movements. But I'm brought to think, and really this is the last sort of gesture that I'll make or direction that I'll point in. I've been thinking through reading this work about the way that the novel reinvents itself in the Romantic period. And I'm thinking of the figures like Anne Radcliffe, Goethe, Madame de Stael, and Walter Scott, through the ingestion of lyric and rhapsodic modes and forms in very different ways. The lyric events in Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, Goethe, for example, work very, very differently from the way they do, say, in Waverley. And Stahl does something really different in Corinne. For one thing, she translates the heroine's lyric rhapsodies into prose, sort of Oceanic or Macphersonian move. So that's something I have currently been thinking about. It's an itch I haven't really scratched, but would like to, and I really present to you nothing more definitive, perhaps, than a series of, or a selection of itches. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing our other panelists.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's always exciting to be reminded of these sort of future avenues that we might all take for research, and also be reminded that perhaps none of us really knows what Scottish Romanticism is. There will be lots we will want to return to again in discussion about this. I think you were, it wasn't explicit that you were talking about canon, but I think these questions of canon and canonicity and what a romantic canon could or should or might or has been are going to be important, I think, to return to. But now I will turn to our next speaker and introduce to everyone Dr. Katie Garner, who's a lecturer in 19th century literature at the University of St Andrews. Katie is the reviews editor for the journal Romanticism and the author of various publications on Romanticism and Arthurian writing, including Romantic Women Writers and Arthurian Legend, The Quest for Knowledge. Katie, if I can invite you to switch on your camera and your mic and talk to us, please.
Thank you, Gillian. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, the role of reviews editor for Romanticism brings with it the expected joy of discovering mysterious and often heavy packages in the pigeonhole, the physical outcome of years of hard labour. And tonight's event offered me a good opportunity, I think, to reflect on those patterns emerging between some of those packages. Time means that the following survey will be brief and I'm sure no doubt partial. There's various reasons why some books come across the desk and some don't. But I have a few opening observations based on productions from the last 4 years, which I'll kind of list at the start. First, I think we appear to be in the middle of a current turn towards the late Wordsworth. Second, as the UK staggers towards a final break with the EU, we've seen important studies of the European context for familiar writers, including Byron, Blake, and Mary Shelley. Thinking here of the reception of William Blake in Europe in 2 volumes edited by Morton Paley and Sabella Earle, and also the very recent release of the edited collection Mary Shelley in Europe, edited by Antonella Breda. Third, Liverpool University Press's Romantic Reconfiguration series, edited by Alan Vardy and Tim Fulford, was only launched 3 years ago, but I think has already become an important home for monographs on non-canonical writers and new scholarly editions. Fourth, the Romantic bicentenaries of the 2010s have encouraged innovative and revealing studies of individual authors, including the reception of Jane Austen, and also the fame and celebrity of Byron and Scott. And 5, and finally, there have been some excellent new teaching editions from Broadview, especially for women writers, including the major poems of Charlotte Smith, Edgeworth's Castle Rackrent, Shelley's Matilda, and multiple Frankensteins from various presses. Since 2015, we've also had a Cambridge Companion to Women's Writing in the Romantic Period, edited by Devaney Lauser, and since 2016, an individual Cambridge Companion to Frankenstein. Writing in 2012 in Studies in Romanticism, Anne Mellor drew attention to what she saw as the relatively restricted expansion of a female romantic canon, emphasising the emergence of a big 3 in the form of Wollstonecraft, Austen and Shelley, along with, she said, the poetry of Charlotte Smith, Felicia Hemans, Anna Letitia Barbauld and Letitia Landon, and some would add Mary Robinson and Hannah More. So I started wondering 8 years on, is this still the case? The largest recent strides in romantic women's writing seem to me to have surrounded Mary Tighe and Anne Radcliffe, a name we've already had mentioned in Ian's talk. The collected poems of Mary Tighe, edited by Paula Feldman and Brian Cooney, appeared in 2016, and her collected letters by Harriet Kramer Lincoln appeared just last month, very weighty package to arrive. The recent news that Angela Wright and Dale Townshend's very capable hands will be steering the Cambridge edition of the works of Anne Radcliffe over the next few years marks another major development in Radcliffe's critical position, solidifying their contribution in their edited collection on Radcliffe from 2014, which, among other things, took Radcliffe seriously as a poet. But evidence of Mellor's restricted female canon, I think, is perhaps evidence in some of the choices for new student-focused editions over the last 5 years, and where Shelley, Edgeworth and Smith have dominated. Developments in the study of romantic women's writing over the past decade might be rather superficially split into 2 strands, the local versus the large, or to put it another way, granular historicism versus big data, or close versus distant reading influenced by Moretti. On the side of the local, Susan Wolfson's Borderlines from 2009 advocated for a commitment to testing large points in local sites, a description that could equally apply to the methods in E.J. Cleary's 1811, Poetry, Protest and Economic Crisis from 2017, a monograph which showed us how, in the absence of deep biographical study, the patriarchal myths surrounding women writers will stubbornly hold their ground. Cleary's book, of course, won the British Academy's Rose Mary Crawshay Prize, endowed in 1888 initially as the Byron Shelley Keats In Memoriam Prize. Cleary's award was not the first time that the prize had been given to the study of a woman writer. Frances Wilson's The Ballad of Dorothy Wordsworth won in 2009, and Anne Stott's Hannah More, the first Victorian, in 2004. But Cleary's book, a highly contextualized reading of a single 334-line poem that builds on William McCarthy's biographical work on Barbauld, shows us, I think, what feminist romantic studies in the 21st century can be, unapologetic about the space that work by romantic women should occupy in our field alongside the life, and the level of close analysis and contextualization that that work can bear. If it is now impossible to imagine Romanticism without Barbauld, then it is exciting to imagine how our field might change over the next 10 years with the addition of new work on Tye and Radcliffe. Less positively, there is evidence to show that on the teaching side at least, we are still giving women a corseted space in the canon. Michelle Levy and Mark Perry's revealing study of the presence of romantic women in teaching anthologies in 2015 concluded that, and I'm quoting from their study here, the Norton Anthology of English Literature has improved its representation of women over its 50-year history, but it has been heading in the wrong direction since 2000 with the removal of Joanna Baillie and the reduction of pages given to women. In 1811, Cleary calls for a fuller sense of collaboration and dialogue between men and women in literary circles in 1811. But the men will always be doing most of the talking if women writers are only allowed a certain amount of space in our definitions of Romanticism. And this brings me to a final point about the local and the global archive. In 2015, Devney Lauser issued a call for us to think more creative and collaboratively about new biographical practices that could emerge for romantic women writers in concert with big data. This call now seems all the more pressing. The engagement of the global online public in digital projects, such as Jenny Batchelor's The Ladies Magazine project, and the use of crowdsourcing in Sharon Rushton's Humphrey Davie's Letters project have shown us how this can be done. In an age of restricted travel, how can we use our local archives to serve a global feminist romanticism? Perhaps this means turning all the more to the resources in our own institutions, creating archive partnerships perhaps that can bring together the dispersed pieces of forgotten women's records. More than ever, there is a need for Romanticism to make room for diverse voices, both women writers and writers of colour. What we can learn from feminist romantic studies, I think, as we address the issue of the decolonisation of our curriculums, is that in order to diversify, we must rebuild and not just add. We must remain a vigilant critical analysis of the shape of the field to make sure that Romanticism is making enough room for women writers and writers of colour. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. I really enjoyed hearing about the patterns in the packages that a reviews editor deals with. And as I turn to thinking about a new course next year called something like Before Brexit, Dreams and Nightmares of Europe, which I intend will include probably 75% women writers, this question of teaching texts and what one can set as a teaching text is a really important one, I think. Affordable editions for students of these kind of exciting texts by women writers in particular are quite hard to come by. And I speak as someone who for many years has been on the editorial board of the Chawton House Library series that produces some really great editions of women writers of the Romantic period. I'm afraid not very many people buy them. So thank you for that. Again, we'll want to return to these questions, I know, but let's now turn to Professor Essaka Joshua, Associate Professor at the University of Notre Dame, the author of numerous publications on Romantic and Victorian literature with a specialisation in disability studies. Her Cambridge University Press monograph, physical disability in British Romantic literature is out this very month. So welcome, Essaka. Can I ask you to switch your mic on and your camera on and join us?
Thanks, Gillian. That's very kind. I'm going to speak to you today from the perspective of my own research. So we're looking at perspectives in the field. So I'm going to do a little bit of a dive into what I've been working on and what what's coming out now and what's going to be coming out in the future. I'm going to sort of return us back to the Anthropocene, very much so. I'm going to talk a little bit about my teaching as well at the end of this. So I'm going to give you an overview of what I'm studying, what the issues are in disability studies, and then tell you a little bit about teaching. Okay, so since the 1990s, developments in disability studies have brought new perspectives to the discussion of diversity. But it's only recently that we've begun to think deeply about the historical development of the disability concept. The word disability is not used in the Romantic period to designate the group of people that we would recognise today. It's a synonym for inability that refers to the prevention of particular functions, but not to the causes of them. We use it to imply both. Romantic era writers also use disability in an alienating sense. So a disabled driver is someone who's prevented from being a driver and not a driver with disabilities. Disabled is also not used as a state-approved category for administrative purposes until the 1830s. So there are many differences in definition and usage, but the most important of these is that disabled people are not a recognised group. So my new book, coming out in the Cambridge Studies in Romanticism series, is about physical disability and specifically the group terms associated with physical disability rather than about individual disabilities. And it continues along several trajectories within Romantic studies, most notably the interest in the body. Some of the earliest stirrings of literary disability studies scholarship appeared in writing on the body at the intersection of body politics and identity politics. More recently, much of the revisionist thinking on the body has been conducted through the lens of the medical sciences, particularly neuroscience, or ideas connected to affect, such as sensibility or philosophy of mind. While disability studies is a subfield within Romantic studies, parallels and occasionally overlaps with medical and neurobiological approaches, it does not centre medicine. It calls to attention lived experiences and the cultures around disability. Disability studies continues the dynamic of inclusion raised by feminist and critical race theory that originates in the civil rights movements that in turn have their origins in Romantic era thought. There's not a straightforward path from abolitionism, enfranchisement, and feminism to disability rights, however. And I discussed some of the ableism at the core of early civil rights thinking, such as the disparagement of impairment that frequently appears in the discourse of women's emancipation in the 1790s. Although my book is a revisionist approach to Romantic studies, it's just as much a rethinking of disability studies approaches to literary history. It's part of what Leonard Davis refers to as second wave disability studies, a phase that revisits and revises the foundational concepts. Bringing together the two fields of Romantic studies and disability studies is not new, but my study is the first to offer a range of alternatives for the term disability, and to argue that it's not a useful term for the period. I aim to show that the meta-narratives of disability that persist in disability studies are dependent on anachronistic concepts of disability that leave unacknowledged the multiplicity of contemporary concepts and favour neat trajectories or a unifying category of disability. I offer a range of case studies that support setting aside these meta-narratives, and I argue that we gain additional insight by using group terms rooted in the period. Modern disability obscures the interplay between concepts in use at the time. For instance, we gain a more nuanced sense of the switch from aesthetics to functionality if we don't focus on a unified concept of disability. The terms and concepts I discuss in the book are capacity, weakness, disabled, in the specific military sense of discharged from the services due to injuries, and the variety of concepts of deformity, I also argue for a separation of discussions of ability and aesthetics, again by demonstrating what's gained when we make these distinctions. For example, the sophisticated aesthetics in Frances Burney's novel Camilla anticipates the theoretical work concerning the relational aspects of disability that occurs in disability theory in the 20th century. Burney's deformity disadvantage distinction anticipates the impairment disability binary of the social barriers approach to disability that we see in disability theory. The concept of deformity is much more aligned with questions of taste and aesthetics than it is with functionality. I conclude that we've held on to the modern concept, or the modern disability concept, for so long in our scholarship, because it firmly unites it to where it belongs, to disabled people, and that we don't lose that when we recover the full history via alternative concepts. So our next project is on disability and British Romantic theatre, and this addresses questions raised by Carrie Sandall, Anne Fox and Philip Auslander in their essay collection, Bodies in Commotion, Disability and Performance, which came out in 2005. They lament the lack of discussion of, quote, the ways in which drama shapes an important part of disability history across several generations of performers and playwrights. I'm currently working on a chapter on Thomas Holcroft's play, Deaf and Dumb, 1801, which explores the connections between sign language, sincerity and melodramatic acting styles. It's a culturally significant play that raises awareness about deaf education and sign language as an integral part of intellectual inquiry and an important humanitarian cause. I was also asked to speak to you about teaching very briefly. I've been away from the classroom for the last 3 years with heavy administrative positions, but I'm planning a course in the spring. So this means I've also missed most of the COVID teaching. So my commiserations to you all. I hope to miss it next semester too. I'm planning an upper level literature course on Romantic and Victorian disability for spring 2021. And it's a mix of canonical and non-canonical literature. Includes disabled writers, in inverted commas, and it's based around 4 themes: madness, sickness, deafness, and intellectual disability. So a quick taste for an investigation of gender, madness, and incarceration. I've put together Mary Wollstonecraft's The Wrongs of Woman, Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White, and we'll be reading those alongside John Clare and some life writing by women who were incarcerated for madness, such as Rosina Bulwer-Lytton, Louisa Lowe and Georgina Weldon. And we'll dip into some disability theory on the subject, such as Peter Cox's wonderful essay, Passing as Sane, or How to Get People to Sit Next to You on the Bus, which I think has the most fabulous title. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. There's much more obviously in the course than that, but giving you 7 minutes of taster of what I'm doing, what I'm about to do, and what I'm going to teach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Essaka. I feel very jealous that you have avoided COVID teaching, and it's very exciting to be thinking about new courses too at this time. I think it does sound like an absolutely wonderful course, and I think one of the exciting things about being in this profession is to think about ways of getting students excited about material that will speak to them in different ways, and material that they certainly won't have encountered in schools. Although the question of how much Romantic period literature they encounter per se in schools is one that we might wish to address. I will move now to our final speaker today, Professor Fiona Stafford, who is a fellow of Somerville College at the University of Oxford, an expert in Romantic literature and the author of a great many publications that we all know on Romantic poetry, Scottish and Irish literature, the novel and place and nature writing, including Local Attachments and The Long, Long Life of Trees. Fiona, can I invite you to join us by switching on your camera and your mic?
Yes, I have done both. Thank you very much, Gillian. Hi. Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the BARS committee for this invitation. One of the things I particularly liked about it was its title, Perspectives on the Field, because it made me think about the nature of a field and what a field is, and what the origin of this metaphor might be. So I had a quick look in the OED, as you do, and it turns out, as you may know, that originally it just meant open ground without trees or buildings. But at the same time, almost immediately, it gained a more purposeful meaning as a battlefield or a cornfield, a hayfield, something productive, if you like, depending on what your battle is, certainly functional in some ways. So right from the beginning, a field is open and yet purposeful, it's peaceful and violent, and then it starts to acquire more meanings. It quickly acquires the meanings of an enclosed space with rules for sport. So we get sports field, cricket fields, quickly then starts to have a competitive edge as well. That meaning we still have the difference between the individual and the rest of the field. But at the same time, it's developing much more expansive meanings, the field of the sky, the field of the stars. So this struck me as quite interesting, with lots of sort of possibilities for thinking about academic fields. But eventually I found our principal meaning, the field of study, emerges in the Romantic period suitably enough. The first citation of field of study is 1825, and I'll just tell you the OED quotation is from Jardine, and it made me smile, so that's why I thought I'd share it with you. This is the OED's definition, earliest citation for field of study. Men of ordinary talents may, nevertheless, by confining their attention to one particular field of study, acquire some eminence. So I think that's not the most encouraging for us, but it's quite interesting. And immediately that this field of study begins to narrow, there's a quick shift as field of study begins to include work in the field idea, in other words, outside the study. So the field is very unstable and dynamic, not at all a pastoral thing we might imagine, though pastoral obviously is also unstable and dynamic. Now, what's all this got to do with recent perspectives on Romanticism? I think it reminds us of space as an organising metaphor rather than time, geography rather than history, which is not to say that time and history aren't important, but I think in recent decades, the idea of space, place, geography has become a major dimension of modern Romantic studies, and we've already had references to this from the earlier speakers. It seems appropriate now, particularly as critical approaches are moving to consider the physical environment in relation to literature, whether it's green or blue. Scholars are approaching literature in relation to the environment, and although this seems strange to suggest that this could be a new perspective, given the very old associations of Romanticism with nature, I think these have been revisited, revived, revised, reimagined, rethought in the last decade. Now, of course, the call to reinstate nature at the heart of Romanticism was being made loudly in the 1990s with Jonathan Bates' Romantic Ecology, and then eco-criticism, which Ian's already referred to. And I think with that came, you know, a new thinking about Wordsworth and Coleridge, but also greater attention to figures who had been a little bit marginalised, people like John Clare.
I think we may indeed have just lost Fiona. Let's see if she can get back to us. Oh dear, connections were going so well. Yes, I blame John Clare.
If she turns her camera off, that might help.
Yes, I think that's right. And perhaps I don't know if she's still there at all. Actually, that's the problem. She seems to have gone completely. Let's give her just a minute to try and reconnect. Not allowed to mention John Clare at bars without special permission. I shall email her forthwith. There's going to be a good 20 minutes for discussion and questions and answers at the end, Daniel. I'm wondering if the thing to do at this stage might be to invite some questions to our first speakers while Fiona tries to get back in. Does this seem like a sensible decision? Perhaps one of the bar's digital committee could email her, and it could email Fiona and try and see if we can offer any help, although I'm not entirely sure what form that help would take. But if someone from the digital committee could do that, maybe Anna.
Yeah, Gillian, I'll email her, and yeah, do go ahead with the questions. That would be great.
Perfect. Right. Well, I'm very sad that was interrupted. Not least because I was wondering about our collective eminence in very narrow fields of study as men and women of mediocre talents. From the her internet has crashed. Okay, thank you for letting us know. Well, this is a great shame, because I was thoroughly enjoying Fiona's talk. But let us reconvene all the speakers. So Jim and Ian and Katie and Essaka, could you all please put your cameras and your cameras on, and I will invite questions. Oh, Fiona's back.
Yes, sorry about that.
Hey, we were just about to start questions and discussion, but I'm very glad you're back. We were all enjoying the talk.
Yeah, well, I'm so sorry, my internet just crashed completely, as it does sometimes. That's the downside of Zoom meetings, of course. So do you want me to finish, or do you want to move on to the panel? Carry on. Okay, I will then. So sorry about that, everybody. So I think what I was suggesting was, I think I just got to the dramatic moment of talking about how eco-criticism has now it's taken a different turn, simply because in the last decade, global concerns with the environment have put so much pressure on the idea of nature. I don't need to tell you about this. Everybody knows about climate crisis, the catastrophic decline of species, using up natural resources, all of these huge problems. And these very urgent concerns give that old tradition of Romanticism as a turn to nature, or a return to nature, a new edge, which is in most ways, extremely unwelcome, as people recognise that nature may not be that eternal consolatory force and refuge that it's sometimes assumed to be. And as these are worries that are not, of course, confined to romanticists, I think it's encouraged dialogues between Romanticism and other literary periods. If you're thinking about the sea, for example, the sea does not belong to Romantic periods. And I think this is partly what Ian was referring to with Eric Gidel's work with geological periods. But it is also sort of made Romanticism open to other disciplines, and I think that's had effect on who counts as romantic writer. We've had a couple of mentions of Humphrey Davie, for example, and that bringing in of scientists. We might think about the Curious Travellers Project, Thomas Pennant being seen as an important writer of the period. But I think what we also maybe should be welcome to, and this is where I start talking a little bit more about my own kind of work really recently, is people actually outside the academy altogether, different sorts of writers. So for example, I have just been reading Tim Dee's recent book called Landfill, which doesn't sound a very promising title, but actually it's really interesting because he's a nature writer and a bird watcher. And he was writing about seagulls, and then suddenly he quotes Coleridge. So I'll just read you this little bit, if I may, simply because we haven't had too much actual romantic poetry yet this evening. So I'll just read you, because I was quite startled to come across it in this book. So suddenly he talks about Coleridge's birds, and he quotes this not very well-known fragment from Coleridge. Seaward, white gleaming through the busy scud with arching wings, the sea mew o'er my head posts on, as bent on speed, now passaging, edges the stiffer breeze, now yielding drifts, now floats upon the air, and sends from far a wildly wailing note. Now, Tim Dee's interested in what Coleridge means by a sea mew, what kind of gull it is. Would he have seen one? And at once this fragment takes on quite a new meaning. We start thinking about, well, where would Coleridge have seen seagulls? Because their distribution in the 1790s was completely different from now. Was this the first seagull he'd seen? As kind of literary scholars, we would immediately start picking up the Miltonic allusions in that fragment, which I won't unpack now, so I haven't got very long to speak about it. But I think what's so instructive is the way Tim Dee, coming to this poetry from a different angle, isn't actually thinking particularly about Milton or Coleridge, but he's very impressed by the accurate, close observation of the natural world. So it's a different strength in Coleridge that is increasingly being admired. And I'm thinking of books like Keir Davidson's recent book on Coleridge's fell walking. And again, that sort of looking to Romanticism for quite different reasons from some of the more traditional ones strikes me as opening up the field in interesting ways. And it might make us, this kind of approach might make us see even really well-known canonical poems like The Ancient Mariner in different ways. So my own recent work on trees and flowers really is very indebted to writers and practitioners outside the fields of Romanticism because of the way it opens up new critical meanings. And I'll just give you kind of one example of a very well-known poem, Gray's Elegy, which everybody will know very well. A line like, beneath those rugged elms that yew trees shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap. Once you start thinking about the detail of the elms and the yew tree, you kind of see why they're in the poem. Yews have obvious associations with death, for example, so that's suitable for Gray's Elegy. This is the double fatal tree as far as Shakespeare is concerned, because they're poisonous, because they're timbers made into bows and for archery, but they're also associated with churchyards, and they're dark, and they have blood red berries. All of these things very much associated with yews in a quite sort of obvious way as soon as you think about it. What I think is less obvious is that elms are also associated with death. And this is the kind of thing I found very interesting when I started researching historical meanings of trees, that elm wood was the standard wood for coffins, which is something that people would have known about in the 18th century, and certainly the rude forefathers would have known about that. So this sort of opens up different dimensions, and it takes you to something like the ruined cottage, and you think about the brotherhood of elms by the cottage. Now, what are the associations there? And I think knowing about or finding out a bit more about specific natural phenomena and what they meant 200 years ago enhances the meanings of the poems and opens up critical dimensions. I mean, it is a way of looking at language, but it's like a different way of looking at language. And I think when we're thinking about our teaching, when we're going through a poem with students, we know that we have to explain what a classical allusion is, or increasingly a biblical allusion. But I think we often don't realise that we need to explain about flowers and trees, and we need to find out, we need to educate ourselves. I've been absolutely amazed by it all. So I'm not thinking in terms of botanical names so much, but just simple words like elm. What does that actually mean? And especially now when, you know, certainly in England, it's very unusual to be able to even see an elm. You can't go and show someone what it is, because since Dutch elm disease, there are so few left. And the kind of critical questions it opens up are, you know, were these phenomena common? Were they things that a writer would have seen for the first time, if it's a weeping willow or a larch tree? These are both introduced in the 18th century. So if they appear in a poem, what associations do they actually have? Would they have been endangered? Because that's another thing, that we assume that, you know, we have the monopoly on endangered species, which is not something to be proud of. But there were species that were disappearing in this period, and people were concerned about, and that might then change the association in a poem and change the meaning of a poem or a novel or whatever. And it might be that these are, you know, we can work out that these are natural phenomena that the author can't possibly have seen. If it's a nightingale, for example, and we know what its distribution is, or a stock dove, we can figure out, well, actually, no, I couldn't have seen that. So therefore, it must be a literary illusion when it looks like a first-hand observation. So, I mean, these are all kind of just examples of what I'm suggesting as a different kind of attention to the natural world. So just wrapping up quickly, if we go back to that original use of field, what I'd like to sort of encourage everybody to do is a bit more kind of field work, and bring some field work into the field. And I think it also helps us engage with, you know, what's been mentioned a couple of times, that the problem of the STEM subjects, because, you know, it means that historical and literary perspectives, art history, all of these things can contribute to, you know, what scientists often think of as hard scientists, but actually in my experience, they're always, you know, absolutely amazed and delighted to find out about history of elms or snowdrops or whatever it might be, because it's such a different sort of take on something they're so interested in. So I'll stop now, and I do apologise for my internet. This does happen, and always at the wrong moment, I find, but I think in the Zoom universe, we're kind of all used to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fiona. That was wonderful. I'm so glad you got back to deliver the rest of it to us. There was such a depth and richness there, from sort of questions of periodization when we think about who counts as a romantic writer, to seeing seagulls and elms, which I shall do myself in a very different way, and this crucial question, of course, of not knowing what our students don't know, not necessarily knowing what our students don't know, or indeed what we don't know. And that was there's lots there that we can pick up on in the questions and discussion. We have a good 20 minutes for these. We advertised the session as being 80 minutes long, but I think we can take until 25 past 6. Of course, if people have to leave a little early, they can do so quietly. But please, can I now invite all of our panels to reconvene with cameras on, and invite questions from our audience.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. I'm under another name. It's my wife's name, Kara Ryan. My name is Leon Chai. The reason I'm using her computer is I could not manage to get on using on my own. I'm sort of a little bit dense with some of this technical stuff. I do have a question actually for all the panelists, and it goes back to Jim's opening talk, in which he gave I think an interesting kind of quick backward look at the history of Romantic studies. The one period of this history that he didn't prominently feature was the period when deconstruction was really in its prime. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is because I think of that going back as the period in which Romantic studies might arguably be said to have occupied a dominant position in the entire field of English studies. And so I guess my question is kind of a Wordsworthian one for all the panelists, namely, is there anything that can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass and glory in the flower? Meaning, is there any way that any of you see whereby Romantic studies might once again return to a kind of position of real sort of dominance or kind of influence over the entire area of English studies? I noticed just one more thing before I close, that Jim in his talk mentioned that one of the things that is happening these days is Romanticism does tend to get subsumed into either the long 18th century or the long 19th century. And I think, like Jim, I feel slight kind of concern and sort of sadness about this, because it seems to me that Romanticism is really a kind of a unique field. And if it does just simply get consumed into these other fields, subsumed into other fields, some of the conceptual criteria that have really defined Romantic studies tend to disappear, because other fields like the Victorian novel use different conceptual criteria. They don't talk the same language as as Romantic studies has tended to talk. Likewise, the 18th century. So this is my question, I guess, for all of the panelists, whether any of you see any way in which Romantic studies might once again return to that position of influence or dominance that it once occupied, say in the late 60s, early 70s.
Thank you very much. That's a big question. Who would like to tackle it first? Jim, would you like to give
Sure.
that a go?
Hi, Leon. Long time no see.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic with this question. Just apropos of deconstruction, I would say that wasn't the first moment where Romanticism was dominant in criticism. I mean, part of my argument is that in the mid-20th century, you had figures like Northrop Frye in Canada, Bloom, who's no deconstructionist, Abrams, certainly no deconstructionist.
Mm-hmm.
All these figures in American criticism who produced major paradigms for the field of literary studies more generally,
mm-hmm.
who were Romanticists.
Right.
And I.A. Richards wasn't exactly a Romanticist, but I think that it's arguable that Shelley, Coleridge, and Wordsworth were the three primary influences on his work
mm-hmm.
in literary studies. A little bit of Matthew Arnold, but I think the Romantics are much more important. He wrote a book on Coleridge, but Wordsworth and Shelley were crucial. You read those early books in the 20s, Wordsworth and Coleridge are all over them.
Uh-huh.
And even somebody like Raymond Williams, he kept, in the beginning, he kept going back. His starting point was always in our period, right?
Mm-hmm.
Think of the figure of the creative artist launching
right.
Long Revolution, the chapter on Coleridge and Burke at the beginning of Culture and Society. So I think deconstruction was already the heir to a formation in which Romanticism had a kind of dominance for literary studies generally. So why was that? One reason is because it's a period that's also defined in relation to, let's say, a genre, a movement. So sort of conceptualization is already inherent in the way we think about what Romanticism is, which is why it's a little bit hard to date it sometimes. Mm-hmm. It's not dated after the reign of a monarch. It's dated in much more fluid terms that depend on conceptualization and where the periodization shifts depending on the national context, right? German Romanticism, slightly different temporality from American Romanticism, and so on. Mm-hmm. I think the other reason is that it was a period in which the categories of the aesthetic and the literary emerged with a certain prominence to challenge other categories like economy, philosophy. You think of German Romanticism, the relationship between the literary and the philosophical in German Romanticism. The literary has a big claim there. How a work of philosophy is written matters to the way it works. So I think it's a bigger question. And I'm very sympathetic to the idea, as part of the burden of my song at the end there, to say that if we allow, you know, a kind of full-scale nominalism to take over our literary history, in which we simply chop things up in terms of periods and so on, we lose something about this. And if we go to a merely inclusive sense of the canon, which is to say, to dissolve the notion of a canon, we kind of just catch as catch can. If we don't have some hierarchy, if we don't formalize our hierarchies of judgment so that we can say why we want to read Equiano rather than Epipsychidion, and why it's more valuable to do that, we lose something about we lose our capacity to generate normative categories for the field of literary studies more generally. So I'm sympathetic. It's an incomplete answer. I'm trying to keep it short, but I'm sympathetic with that.
Okay.
Would any of our other panelists like to speak to that question?
I just offer a couple of very brief remarks. I did my graduate work at Yale in the sort of latter end of Paul de Man died at the end of the first semester when I was a PhD student at Yale. And at Yale, then you weren't allowed to be a Romanticist if you didn't work on, you know, Wordsworth, Shelley, etc. I worked on the novel. You know, Walter Scott, where does he fit in? Jane Austen sort of perfects an 18th century novel form. Scott is sort of inchoate precursor of the Victorian novel. So I found that the category of Romanticism deeply problematic. Having said which, I do want to echo what's just been said, and I would actually defend our retaining it. Partly because what Jim calls these nominalist, chronologically focused categories, I think naturalize a certain notion of history that then becomes deeply problematic. And I would actually defend the absurdity of having Romantic followed by Victorian. You know, you have a term that denotes an aesthetic ideology, to quote McGann, followed by a term that denotes the reign of a monarch, right?
Right.
And then we have another aesthetic ideology, modernism. I mean, it's ridiculous, but I think the absurdity does some useful work in actually estranging us from and inviting us to think critically about the period categories that we're using.
Can I just contribute to this very, very briefly? I agree with everything that's been said, and I especially agree with what Ian's just said about Victorian as a kind of period, because it's kind of very Anglo-centric, really, and that's perhaps something we might bring into this discussion, is if Romantic doesn't just mean Romantic period, and this is, you know, back to McGann, but it's actually a set of ideas or a kind of writing or whatever. You know, then does it extend to Yeats, for example? You know, I mean, these are questions. It's not an answer, but I think I found myself listening to you and thinking, am I thinking Romantic period, in which case Burns and Scott come in and they're absolutely huge, dominate Scottish literature, or am I thinking Romanticism, in which case Yeats is major figure in Irish literature, which is not an answer at all, but I think it kind of complicates things. And actually, the emphasis on Europe that we've had in several moments already this evening, I think that's really, really helpful if we're thinking about Romanticism, is trying to think about different Romanticisms that are going on perhaps in different times and in different art forms as well. So it doesn't really answer your question at all. It's just a sort of response to what everyone else is saying.
No, I was thinking that myself, Fiona, when I was thinking about what Katie was talking about in terms of, you know, all these recent publications that respond to Europe and look at reception of European authors in Britain and vice versa. And that if one works, as I do, on the French novel in the Romantic period, French scholars of French literature don't think one is a Romanticist. It's these problems of periodization, return and return. I'm conscious that we have a lot of questions here, and I noted quite early on that Claire Connolly had one. So Claire, can I ask you to ask your question?
Thanks, Gillian. Trying to take up the invitation to think across the field in the way these brilliant papers made us do. I'm wondering about a tension between a kind of broadly a set of new books and essays that take their guidance from current concerns, the environment, Brexit, and find new ways into older authors or recover new authors as a result. And you could wonder about the relationship between, you know, the kind of the back and forth and the shift. That's a really interesting one. You could track it in all kinds of ways. So that's kind of one set of things we heard about tonight. And then there's also, or this morning or whenever it is, and then also there's the kind of invitation Ian gave us to think about the way in which literature kind of tests the capacities of different periodizations or kind of chronological frames we put around it. And I think you mentioned the Maureen Mclean and Laura Slatkin essay where they talk about how that older idea going back to Ossian and so on, where the antiquarians believed that societies could be compared, could be usefully compared, and that literature was a useful tool in doing that. And then to go to poetry, for example, to recover specimens of native poetry was to recover something stable and knowable and relatively fixed. And that sort of echoes in a way with what Fiona was saying about elms and, you know, how we need to kind of recover one stable meanings for students and so on, the teaching. So it's about that tension really, the kind of the movement and the flux with political concerns and the capacity of literature to kind of form a kind of matter, I suppose, in the way Ian suggested. And I don't mind who answers.
Thank you, Claire. Would anyone like to tackle this head on?
I don't want to keep speaking. Hi, Claire. It's great to hear from you. Yeah, I would just add very briefly, I think implicit in the Jadal book I mentioned and more explicit in the work of Tobias Manili that I mentioned is actually a strong defense of literature, precisely for the ways in which it can register things that other modes of human inscription cannot or are unable to. That's I think the big claim underlying some of this writing. And you know, we want to avoid remystifying literature, but I think what to me is actually exciting about this work is the way that it's getting us to rethink, say, lyric in the particular case of Manili's work as a historical object that is doing something, is registering something that other human utterances, as they've come down to us in various forms, cannot and do not. And that's something I certainly would like to think further about.
I don't know if this is a direct answer to the question, but it allows me to tie in something that Fiona said about birds. And that is that you take a poem like The Nightingale by Coleridge, it already has that problematic internal to its rhetoric, right? When Coleridge misrecognizes the sound of the nightingale, most musical, most melancholy bird, because he's hearing Milton. He is already confusing or acknowledging a confusion, which is in a certain level an unconscious confusion, which he wants to make conscious, between a literary illusion and a sensation that he's actually having from an object in nature. And to me, this gets closer to Claire's question, maybe something about the way these texts can speak back to us, you know, above and around our political concerns. Especially when we learn to honor their codes in the right way. I was just teaching the Bride of Lammermoor last night, and that introduction, that Dick Tinto chapter introducing the Bride of Lammermoor, which was just dismissed by critics for a long time. George Levine says, "Oh, Scott is just fooling around." I think if you read that chapter carefully and kind of trust Scott and to push on him and see if he pushes back, you know, you find that it really unlocks the novel. But shifting canons involve shifting levels of trust. And, you know, at a certain point, we didn't care so much about the conversation poems. When we started to care about them, we started to see things like, oh, Coleridge is already doing this weird thing about the difference between a literary illusion and, you know, the registering of a sensation.
Thanks very much, Claire. I wonder if I could come in. I think I was struck by what Fiona was saying about the seagull, and how I'd never really thought about the seagull being so exotic as it began to sound when you were talking, Fiona. But then also, you know, in the circumstances we find ourselves now, the seagull may well again become exotic, and whether there's actually a relationship between the two things that you were talking about, in that, you know, in creating essay collections that reflect upon our own political moment, we're also recording, in a sense, our own capacity to think about those terms in new ways. You know, I've had students talk to me about Frankenstein as being about moments of self-isolation, for example, which is something that, you know, has never come up ever before in discussions of that novel. And the kind of presentism versus historicism, I think, is obviously can work both ways, I think.
Thank you very much, Katie. That leads us on quite nicely, I think, to a question that was posed in the chat by Nikki Watson, and then followed up by Alison Daniel. So Nikki invited everyone to look into your crystal balls and speculate on what the pressure of 2020 is likely to be on the field. And Alison followed up by saying, you know, what avenues might open out for research. And I think, Katie, you just highlighted one there, but I wonder if I can ask panelists to speculate on others. Essaka, if you have anything to offer here, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, thank you. 2020 is a funny year. I mean, you've got the Black Lives Matter movements on the one hand, and then you've got COVID on the other. So you've got two massively different tensions that are going on. For me, you know, the Black Lives Matter thing is extremely important. And I think on the back of that, I mean, one of the questions, well, the first two questions dealt with the idea of how will Romanticism as a discipline come back, or Romantic studies come back. I don't think it ever left, but how we make it central to the discipline. And the answer to that question is the major political events that are important, that feed into what's going on now, happened in that period. They will never not be relevant. It's a period entirely about equality, enfranchisement, and that's more in jeopardy now than it ever has been. So it's, you know, I think the relevance is going to be political enfranchisement. It's going to be making sure we have diversity in the academy. It's going to be bringing new voices forward, which is why disability studies is so important and is growing. I think those are the things that are going to be the issues. COVID, yes, because we started teaching and thinking in new ways. Everything's online quicker than, you know, the international conversation is incredibly important, because, you know, we couldn't do this in normal circumstances. And I hope this stays, that we have conferences like this, that we can actually get together without killing the planet via air travel. So I think there's a lot of things that are all very interlinked here, you know, the environmentalism, the activism piece, and, you know, and I say in the UK, the structures are there to make sure you have impact as part of what you deliver. So, you know, we don't have that in the US, but, you know, there are ways in which we're being forced to address the current political situation. And I think the incentives will be there money-wise to do so.
Yes, I wonder if the field is going to be permanently changed by these new online ways of working. I mean, I think I won't be alone in missing the conviviality of in-person meetings, but it's certainly true that this. I note from the chat that some people are cooking supper, and a great many others are talking about cooking supper, and that's something that you can't do if you've just flown over to Chicago, say, to take part in a big conference, leaving aside the fact that our administrative budgets will not permit such a thing. I wouldn't have thought going forward. Would anyone else like to look into their crystal ball and think about what this year in particular might mean for avenues in research or the field of the future?
Can I address that?
Please.
just very briefly, one of the things I've been teaching a lot of literature and cinema courses in keeping with this book project I'm doing, and it's not as if it should have taken the pandemic for me to discover this, but the wealth of what's available in the archive that can be made instantly available in a classroom has led me to think a lot more about what Ian was talking about, which is new forms of mediation. So this gives me a chance to plug a book by Mike Good called Romantic Capabilities, the subtitle of which is Blake Scott Austin and the New Messages of Old Media. So it's about, it's sort of following on Rigney's book about Scott and the afterlives of Scott, but it focused specifically on the remediation of these authors in forms of adaptation and so on, which are now going to be much more readily available to us in ways that I have become myself much more conscious of teaching remotely as I've been doing, because you're looking for ways to compensate for the loss of face-to-face, and the resources of the internet in these areas, and especially in new media areas, are extraordinary. So that's bound to have some impact on the field going forward, I think.
Yes, I agree. It's been invaluable to be able to have recourse to some of these great databases and online resources and point students towards them very quickly as a way of enhancing their learning. There are a lot of questions still to be still in the chat here, to the extent I'm feeling slightly overwhelmed by them. Some are very specific for individual colleagues, and I think perhaps the best thing would be for these to be followed up more individually. There are some very important big questions or big comments actually about the field more generally. That 2020 has brought very few jobs in Romanticism. It has brought very few jobs in literature, full stop. And I think a diminished pool of Romantic period scholars is certainly a problem. There's a problem in literature departments, in English departments, in modern languages departments too. And I think that's one of the distressing things that the pandemic can only have made worse. Certainly it will not have been made better. Too many people chasing too few jobs. That's a sobering note on which to draw conclusions to an end here. But I think it's an important one. We are the fortunate ones. And I know are all working hard from our own in our own institutions to make sure our students have the support they need to continue their work and to work in other areas too. But I think I will now, since it is half past 6, and I know that people have teaching to go on to, draw our proceedings to a close. I would like to thank our speakers once again for really thought-provoking papers. This hour and a half has sped by, and I would have liked to have heard a great deal more from each and every one of you. And I want to thank all our audience for a really lively and interesting question and discussion, again, all too short. The April 1989 conference in Winchester took great care on the first page of the programme to point out that the bar was located in the Student Union building and that extensions had been arranged until midnight. Now, I wish I could point you in the direction of such a bar this evening, but perhaps it's just as well that we can disperse to enjoy our time zone appropriate refreshments. And check what's happening with Biden and Trump on your side of the Atlantic. But although we're unable to continue our discussions today, I hope very much that you will join us again for the next BAR's digital event. This will take place at 5 p.m. on Thursday, the 26th of November, and it's a roundtable discussion on digital editions in Romantic period studies, a discussion between Professor Linda Pratt, Dr. Sophie Colombo, Dr. Karina Redyoff, and Ben Wilkinson Turnbull on that topic. So digital editions in Romantic studies, chaired by BAR's president, Professor Anthony Mandel. Do join us for that. and have a very good evening, morning and afternoon in the meantime. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.